Hello everyone and welcome to a seminar. My name is Eva Marek. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. And today I have the pleasure to be the host of our Bigger Picture seminar. This is our first seminar in this year. And for those who join us for the first time, CEB stands for our department, and the Bigger Picture indicates the ambition and the motivation for our seminars. So our main focus in the seminar series is on energy, healthcare, and sustainability. So the three strategic research themes of our department. And to look at the bigger picture for these three areas, we invite experts and thought leaders from around the world. So this is truly a fantastic opportunity for students and for a broader audience to look at the bigger picture with us and also to participate in those extremely timely discussions, finding inspiration and hopefully motivation for future research and career paths. And before we move to our speaker for today, a quick advertisement for our next talk on February the 9th. Please register online. You can use the QR code in here or just go on our website with Bigger Picture seminars. And in February, we're going to have a talk by Professor Lin Lu from Princeton University. And now it's time to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Dame Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge. Baroness Brown of Cambridge is an engineer with bachelor, master's, and doctorate degrees from Cambridge and over 160 publications on structural materials, engine materials, and propulsion technologies. And beyond the scientific work, Baroness Brown is well known for her advocacy on reducing carbon emissions, her engagement and leadership in multiple UK and European leading institutions, but also for her advocacy on diversity and equality in STEM subjects. And just to name a few of Julia's roles, she chairs the Royce Institute for Advanced Materials. She chairs the Carbon Trust. She is a non-executive director of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. For 12 years, she was a deputy chair of the Climate Change Committee, the leading independent UK committee advising the government on strategic objectives and priorities for low carbon economy and on the impact on climate change. Now, Julia still leads the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee. And Julia's work has been recognized on multiple occasions. She's a fellow of both the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society. She is Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. She is a honorary graduate and a fellow of more than 10 universities and colleges, including Murray Edwards College and Churchill College from Cambridge. And I can continue this list until we run out of time for today's seminar, but I trust we can all appreciate our speaker. So I will not stop sharing my screen. Before I hand it over to Julia, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please ask your questions on Q&A, and after the talk, we are going to ask the questions to Julia. So thank you very much. That's it from me. Julia, Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good to be here, even though sadly I can't see all of you, which is very sad. It's very odd talking to an audience you can't see. But let me share my screen and get going. Hopefully this will work. So I want to talk to you about net zero, but I also want to talk to you about the fact that even if we reach net zero, we will still see very significant changes in our climate, even here in the UK. So we also need to adapt to make ourselves resilient to the changes in climate that are to come. So net zero is not enough. And I think the big kind of excitement in a way about net zero, I think has perhaps made some people forget that actually we need net zero and we need adaptation and resilience. And of course, this week, the government published on Monday its third climate change risk assessment for the UK. And I'll talk a bit about that towards the end of my lecture. Now, with a bit of luck, I can get these buttons to work. So, of course, we all know the climate is changing. This is one of my favorite indicators of the climate changing. This is the date of full flowering cherry blossom day in Kyoto. And I love this indicator because clearly the people of Kyoto are so passionate about cherry blossom that they have been recording this date since the early 800s. So I think it's a brilliant long-term data set. And we can see that the date of full flowering cherry blossom day has come forward by about 15 days in that period. And all of that has happened since the Industrial Revolution, since the sort of middle of or the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But of course, we can look at the changing climate in more conventional ways. Here is the temperature record to 2020 from the Met Office, and the Met Office actually have just published their report that says that 2021 is the 7th hottest year on record. So it's still part of this data set. We've seen the hottest decade on record in the last 10 years. So what's the future going to be like? So here's that record to 2020. Here's what we've committed to in the Paris Agreement to stay well below 2 degrees and to with the ambition of keeping temperature rise by the end of the century to no more than 1.5 degrees. And you can see we're very close to that already. This is what temperature could look like if we're meeting that target of staying below 2 degrees. What this reminds us is we may have just had the hottest decade on record, but between now and 2050, even if we're on a net zero pathway globally, every decade will be the hottest decade on record. So that's what the positive outcome looks like. But of course, actually, we don't have the policies and actions in place globally to achieve that. And if we look at actually the action that's been taken globally, there's still a significant chance we could be on a path to something closer to 4 degrees. And if that's the case, whoops, sorry, got ahead of myself. If that's the case, then this is the kind of temperature increase we could be faced with. So something that clearly we all very much hope will not be the case. But I think the message I wanted to get across was, even if we're on that path to net zero, then every decade to 2050 is likely to be the hottest decade we have ever experienced. And 2021, I think, gave us some pretty strong messages, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are going to be giving us some more messages in February about adaptation and resilience. And one of the things it's coming through is that although our climate modeling is doing a good job of telling us what the sort of average temperature rise will be, the thing that we are starting to see is that we are seeing more of the extremes. Extremes like the appalling flooding in Germany last year, extremes like the 50°C temperature dome over Canada and North America last year, extremes like the increases in wildfires and the length of the wildfire season in Australia and California, droughts and floods right across the globe. So we are, although the average may not look as if it's too frightening a prospect, the extremes are really becoming significant. And of course, we're starting to see the cost of those as well. And if we look at the hydrological, climatological and meteorological events, all of which could well be climate related, not the geophysical, we can see that since the 1980s, we've seen something like almost a 5 times increase in the estimated global economic damage from the kind of insurance industry. So we have in the UK a piece of groundbreaking legislation called the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act was legislated back in 2008. It was, I think, the world's first legislated target to reduce our emissions. And the bit everybody knows about is that the legislation was to reduce that we would make a commitment to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. That was the legislation back in 2008. What people tend to know less about is that it not only deals with reducing our emissions, but it also deals with adapting to the changes in climate. So it sets up a mitigation committee and an adaptation committee. It set a legal target to reduce UK greenhouse gas emissions, and it set up a process of 5-year carbon budgets on our pathway to 2050. And we've set into law so far 6 of those, taking us up to 2037. But it also sets in progress a process where every 5 years, the government must publish a UK climate change risk assessment. And as I say, the latest one of those, which is the 3rd, was published on Monday. And whereas the Mitigation Committee, which is what we normally call the Climate Change Committee, sets the carbon budgets, the Adaptation Committee provides the research and the advice on which the government sets the climate change risk assessment. And the climate change risk assessment is then followed a year after by a national adaptation programme. So next year we will have our 3rd national adaptation programme, which is supposed to show how we are going to deal with the risks of climate change to the UK. And the Adaptation Committee then monitors the government's progress in addressing those risks, just as the Mitigation Committee monitors the government's progress in reducing emissions. So there are 2 parts to the Climate Change Act, and the adaptation part is the part that you hear quite a lot less about. However, I'm going to actually start by talking about mitigation and talking about our path to reaching net zero. So as I've said, when the legislation was first passed, the target was an 80% reduction in emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But in 2019, on the advice of the Climate Change Committee, the government changed the legislation. It made one amendment. It changed the 80% figure to 100%. So we now have a legal commitment to reduce our emissions by 100% by 2050. And actually, as this really simplistic chart shows, although 80% to 100% doesn't sound like that much, it's a considerable increase in the slope of that line, because we've got to do it over the next 30 years. So it really is quite a significantly bigger target than the 80% reduction target. Oopsie days, I'm sorry about that. So when the challenge was to reduce our emissions by 80%, when we got to 2050, there was quite a chunk of remaining emissions that we didn't need to reduce by 2050. There was some remaining emissions in industry. There was a significant chunk of the heat in buildings, which are quite difficult to decarbonize. There was heavy transport. There was the emissions from aviation, the emissions from shipping, and quite a chunk of emissions from agriculture as well. So those hard to abate, expensive to abate sectors didn't need to completely abate their emissions. Now we've got, now we've got a net zero target. We really do have to address those difficult to abate emissions. And when you look at what we needed to do to get to 80%, we didn't really need to use hydrogen for anything. We could get to 80% without needing to use hydrogen as an energy vector. When you get to looking at those hard to abate emissions, for example, in industry, for example, in steel making, for example, some of the challenges in heavy transport, or indeed in shipping, then actually you find you start to need a fuel like hydrogen. So you go as far as you can with energy efficiency and electrification, and then using fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. And then you find you get to a point where you need something else. And that something else in almost all those areas turns out to be hydrogen, or hydrogen, for example, in the form of ammonia. So that's why you're hearing so much now about hydrogen, about electrolysis, about green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and indeed pink hydrogen. And we seem to have a rainbow of hydrogens that you hear about, because all of those hard to abate sectors on that previous chart, industry, heat, heavy transport, aviation and shipping, and indeed parts of agriculture, we can see hydrogen can come in and help us to take those emissions down even further. And then hydrogen has some additional benefits, which is that we can use it for generating electricity. And very importantly, we can use it for long-term storage, because that's one of the big challenges with obviously an energy system that depends very strongly on renewables that are seasonally and time of day dependent, like solar, like wind. You need to be able to produce something when the wind is blowing and store it, sometimes over long periods, to use at times when the wind isn't blowing. And batteries are good for short-term storage, but we have very little that's good for long-term storage. So hydrogen plays a really crucial role potentially in energy storage as well, particularly in a high renewables generating system. So where are we starting in terms of thinking about getting to net zero? So these are the range of sectors that we look at on the Climate Change Committee that we monitor emissions reduction for. And you can see that we only have one sector, power, electricity generation, that looks as if it might have a cat in hell's chance of getting to net zero at the moment. The only line coming down towards zero is that red one, which is electricity generation. And that's been driven primarily by taking coal off the system, but now the gentler slope is being driven by replacing some of our electricity generation with the quite rapid growth we're seeing now in renewables. Industry is coming down slowly, but not at the kind of rate it needs to get down to zero in 2050. And indeed, we have two very challenging areas through the middle, the blue line and the orange line, which are surface transport and heat in buildings, all of the gas we burn in buildings. So although we have some pretty good solutions in transport, we're just not implementing them fast enough. And buildings are genuinely expensive and challenging to decarbonize. But to get to net zero, we've got to get all of those lines moving in a direction much more like that one for the electricity, the decarbonisation of the electricity system. So thinking about how we're going to get there, the Climate Change Committee has kind of categorised the solutions into these four areas. So first of all, we've got to do everything we can to improve energy efficiency, to reduce demand, and of course to improve the resource efficiency of the materials we use, because many of those are energy intensive materials in their own right. So reducing demand, whether it's the amount of power we use or the amount of resources we use. Then it's a huge chunk, the orange and red and yellow chunk, the take up of new technologies. And the really biggest contributor is electrification. So wherever we can, electrification of vehicles, electrification of heat in our homes, electrification of industrial processes. Where we can't use electrification, hydrogen, and where that won't work either, then fossil fuel use with carbon capture and storage. In order to support all that electrification, of course, we need to expand our low, indeed our zero carbon electricity system. And even then, there are some emissions that we can't actually completely remove. And so we need offsetting, and hopefully as much of that offsetting as possible can be through nature-based solutions, trees and plants and peat restoration, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's how we get to net zero in simplistic terms. And underpinning that are some really dramatic changes to our energy system. So today we use about 300 terawatt hours of electricity a year. Underpinning the Climate Change Committee's core scenario for getting to net zero, we move up to using about 700, somewhere between 700 and 750 terawatt hours of electricity a year. So we've got to more than double the size of our electricity system to provide all of that electrification. And indeed, some scenarios suggest we may even have to treble the size of our electricity system. And if we want to use a lot of electrolytic hydrogen, it could be 3 to 4 times the size of electricity system that we have today. Accompanying that dramatic increase in the size of our electricity system, of course, is a dramatic decrease in our use of natural gas. And given the challenges we're having today with the cost of natural gas, if only we could do this more quickly, it would be much, much better for people. But you can see that that by the 2050s, we're using gas. We're only using gas either to make hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, or to generate electricity with carbon capture and storage. And similarly, we're seeing a dramatic reduction in oil use, such that by 2050, the predominant use of oil is probably still for aviation fuel. And that's one of the things that we'll need to be offsetting significantly with, hopefully, those nature-based solutions by 2050. But those really dramatic reductions in oil and gas use accompanying that increase in the size of the electricity system, and recognizing that this chart is now on a different scale, but also a very significant growth in hydrogen use, essentially the growth of a new low carbon and preferably green hydrogen industry that's going to be providing the fuel for decarbonising industry particularly, but also for areas like shipping as well. So really growing this new industry from scratch and looking at how do we really take the cost out of processes like electrolysis. So just to kind of emphasize how different our energy system will be. Today, we use about 2,000 terawatt hours of energy in total in all forms, but only 300 terawatt hours of that is electricity. So you might say we were 15% electric. It's a very simplistic way. In 2050, we'll be much, much, much more efficient because an electric car is much more efficient. It's probably about 3 times as efficient in the way it uses energy from an internal combustion engine driven car. Heat pumps are more efficient than gas boilers. So our energy use becomes hugely more efficient. In fact, many studies show we probably reduce our total energy use by something like a factor of 2. But we move to that being predominantly electricity, with a small amount of oil and gas being used with carbon capture and storage, and in some cases to produce hydrogen. So you might say by 2050, we're 70% electric, and that has some significant implications. So just really to emphasize the scale of the change that we're going to need to see in the next 30 years. The electricity system has to somewhere between double and treble in size. We currently have 10 or 11 gigawatts of offshore wind operating around our coasts. We have to get to about 100 gigawatts of offshore wind. That's a huge growth in that industry. We've got to completely transform the electricity system, the grid that supports and links, obviously, the generators to the consumers. It's got to be much bigger. It's got to be much, much more flexible. It has to incorporate much more storage, and it has to become resilient to all sorts of new and different challenges, one of those being the changing climate itself. We've got to start a hydrogen industry and grow it almost to the scale of the electricity industry today. We've got to start a carbon capture and storage industry. We've got to transform 29 million buildings to make them zero carbon buildings. We've got to get up to about 35 million electric cars on our road and provide the charging points to enable people to use them. We've got to increase our rate of new forest and woodland plantation by a factor of about 5, which will increase the area of woodland and forest in the UK by about 4%, which is actually quite a dramatic change. We've got to see changes, significant changes in agriculture to make space for all of this forest and woodland plantation, and in order to also help make space and change agriculture, we need to see significant changes in our diet, reducing our consumption, particularly of meat and dairy. So we've done things on that scale over 30-year periods historically before. We've just never done quite so many all at the same time. And in some ways, it's going to get tougher. Up to now, 80% or so of the reduction in emissions that we've achieved has come from the reduction in emissions in electricity generation, taking coal off the system. It's come from things that you and I didn't have to be involved with. It didn't require us to change our behavior in any way. The same electricity still comes out of the socket and still does all the things we need it to do. As we move forward, only about 40% of what we need to do comes from changes in manufacturing technologies or further changes to the electricity system, things that actually don't involve us to think about changing our behavior. But about 60% of what we need to do actually involves the population to be genuinely engaged in the process, to make different decisions, to do different things, to behave in more cost-effective or more economical ways. So we really have a challenge in getting people engaged in this transformation in the next 30 years in a way they definitely haven't had to be up to now. So that might be more difficult, but actually this is easier. When Nick Stern looked at the economics of climate change, he thought it might cost 2 or 3% of GDP to decarbonize the economy. When we looked in 2008 at how much it would cost to get down to 80% emissions, we thought it would cost 1 to 2%. Looking in the work on the 6th carbon budget, the Climate Change Committee analysis suggests it could cost as much as 1%, but probably as little and more likely down at about 0.5% or less of GDP to get to 100% reduction. And that's come because of the phenomenal reduction we've seen in the cost of new technologies, the phenomenal reductions we've seen in the cost of solar, the cost of batteries, the cost of offshore wind. As these new technologies come in, they've been cost reduced amazingly quickly, and it gets cheaper and cheaper, if you like, to get to net zero. And of course, what more recent economic studies have looked at, like some of the work that's been done at Oxford, is in looking at the kind of economic growth you will get from these new technologies, that we actually may see 2 to 3% increase in GDP associated with going down the green transformation rather than continuing with the type of economy we have at the moment. So a really positive picture on the cost of the transformation, but interesting challenges for our Treasury in terms of the investments. So we need an increased investment, getting up to about 50 billion additional investment in infrastructure per annum. And there will be operating cost savings, and those operating cost savings will by 2050 could quite well balance out the additional infrastructure costs. But the challenge is the big savings come in transport because of the extra efficiency. So transport becomes significantly cheaper, but many of the other things don't. So that will be a challenge for the Treasury, which is how do you redistribute those transport savings to enable them to make other things in the economy, other changes in the economy affordable and pay for the additional investment that will be required. So the government has now published its net zero strategy, published it at the end of last year, at the end of 2021. And I think you can criticize it for a lot of things, but I think you have to say this is the first comprehensive strategy that talks about how a country can get to net zero that has been published in the world. So it is, I think, genuinely a world-leading net zero strategy. It sets out the scenarios that we need to get to net zero by 2050 and the 78% reduction by 2035, which is what the 6th carbon budget from the Climate Change Committee demands. It covers all sectors of the economy, so it's pretty comprehensive and it's pretty ambitious. And it doesn't involve us buying any international carbon credits. So all of it is either reduction or carbon removals that are taking place in the UK. So we're not having to rely on somebody else planting forests or doing anything else. We're doing it in the UK. It aligns very closely with the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee in the 6th carbon budget. For example, we get to a completely decarbonised electricity system by 2035. So it's got a lot of very good features. It has some things that I would say were not so good. It avoids the issue of behaviour change. So it's very much focused on technology solutions, good for people in universities generally, but it doesn't look at how might we approach issues like reducing the amount of meat and dairy or reducing demand for aviation, the things that are clearly sensitive for politicians. And though it talks about enabling people that might indicate a move to behaviour change, it doesn't see that really as a role for government. So it's kind of 7 out of 10, I think. It has a lot of the right things, but it does avoid some of the more challenging areas. And if we were to look at it in a very simplistic way like this, the figures are the percentage contribution to emissions in the economy today. So it's good on surface transport and power generation. It's reasonably good on buildings and industry, but just as behaviour change is a sensitive area, agriculture and land use is a hugely sensitive area. And 72% of the land area of the UK is farmed or forested, so is managed by farmers and land managers. And it really doesn't get to grips with tackling the changes that are going to be needed in agriculture and land use, and the knock-on into our behaviour and what we eat. So it's pretty good, but more work needed in some areas. So we're getting to the right place. Of course, it's all talking about policy, and we desperately need, of course, not just to talk about policy, but to implement policy and to make sure the right actions are actually happening. So that is, of course, the next big challenge. But as I've said, net zero itself is not enough. And I think this picture for me represents net zero is not enough. A Tesla charging station that's been plonked somewhere that is susceptible to flooding. So it makes it completely unusable. So if we want to reduce the impacts of climate change, we have to reduce the climate risk. And we reduce the hazard by reducing the emissions. So it gets less hot, we get less extremes, we're less likely to get drought, etc. But in terms of the impacts of that hazard, we need also to look at how exposed are we to the hazard and how vulnerable are we to the hazard. And adaptation is the part of dealing with climate change that looks at how do we reduce exposure and how do we address vulnerability. And it's reducing the hazard, the exposure and the vulnerability that reduce the impacts like the deaths or the economic impacts or the other kinds of losses that the climate change delivers. So the climate, as I've said, the Climate Change Act covers both mitigation and adaptation is the bit you normally don't hear so much about. But adaptation we definitely need. We've been reminded in the UK recently just how hot it can get. The highest ever recorded temperature was recorded in the UK, was recorded in Cambridge in July 2019 in the Botanic Gardens of nearly 39 degrees centigrade. And the recent research shows that the rate of increase of the hottest daytime temperature down in the southeast where we are is now running at about a degree per decade. So we can certainly expect to be seeing 40-degree temperatures before 2050. if we go on without changing our behaviour, we're going to see increasing water deficits, and that's going to be an issue for us again in the Cambridgeshire area, particularly critical because we grow an enormous amount of the UK's food and fresh vegetables and salads around Cambridgeshire in the Fens. But if we're in a 2-degree scenario by 2050, we could have a deficit of something like 650 million litres per day. If we're actually more closer to a 4-degree trajectory, it will be significantly higher than that, and it gets higher still as we get into the 2080s. We've had 7 of the wettest years on record in recent years, and even if we're on that net zero path, the number of people living in areas at significant risk of flooding goes up very significantly. Climate change is really noticeably affecting our nature and our countryside. Germany has recently done a survey published in 2020 of their forests. They're seeing climate change damage from the wetter winters, the drier summers, and new pests and diseases coming in. And they're seeing that affecting something like 80 to 90% of their core tree species. And we have the assessment from the Woodland Trust in this country that ash dieback is likely to kill about 80% of the UK's ash trees. So we're seeing the same sorts of things happening in the UK. So nature is being very significantly affected by the changing climate already. And we need to recognise that even on this net zero compliant path, we're going to see something like another ½ degree or so of increase in average temperatures. The hot heat wave summer like 2018, which we had a 10% chance of or so, will become a typical summer by the middle of the century. Summer rainfall will drop, could be by as much as 24%. Winter rainfall will increase. Heavy rainfall, when that rain comes, it's more likely to come in relatively short periods of extremely heavy rain, the sort of rainfall that causes surface water flooding, the surface water flooding that we saw in London a couple of times last year, flooding people's basements, flooding the tube system, that kind of thing is going to become more common. And sea level is going to continue to rise, giving rise to more problems of coastal erosion and flooding around the coast. So we need to adapt our buildings. Here's a shocking conversion of offices into flats in London, where in 2018, the internal temperatures of the unshaded flats reached almost 50 degrees, temperatures high enough to kill a small child or cause real problems to a person with asthma. So we've really got to think about how do we keep our buildings cool in these very hot summers. We've got to think about what kinds of trees are we planting. By 2050, beech trees will struggle in the hotter and drier conditions in the southeast of England. And similarly, so will Sitka spruce. So we've got to make sure we're planting the right kinds of trees in the right place as we do all that new woodland and forest creation to sequester the carbon emissions to get us to net zero. We've got to think about water consumption. Say we live in a water-stressed region in Cambridgeshire, around East Anglia. We also live in a region where there are plans for very significant increases in house building, because it's a region where there's there are lots of jobs where people want to live. So we've really got to think about how do we reduce the water demand in those new homes. How do we make sure we address leaks? If we look at an adaptation scenario where we reduce household water consumption from the current level of 140 litres per person per day to around about 90 litres per person per day, which is a level that some other European countries already achieve. So it's not rocket science at all. But if we look at that scenario, plus reducing industry's water use at a similar percentage, plus addressing leaks, then actually we can get to 2050 without suffering the kind of water shortages, the kind of supply-demand imbalance that the first of these charts suggests. So adaptation can work, but we have to start doing it now. And of course, we need to avoid lock-in. We need to stop building in flood-prone areas and in areas that we know are going to become flood-prone, whether that's coastal flooding, river flooding, or indeed surface water flooding in towns and cities. And you can see we're not doing that yet. This is a plot that shows the proportion of new developments that are still going on in flood-prone areas around the UK. And we also need to think about inequality, because one thing that climate change does, and we see it internationally, is that it exacerbates inequality. The disadvantaged are disproportionately affected by climate change. And that's not just true in comparing rich countries like the UK with poorer parts of the world, particularly in the global south. That's true actually here on our doorstep, that if you are, if you have a low income, if you're older and less able to, less mobile perhaps, living on a pension, you are more likely to live in an area that where housing is cheaper. That's probably more likely, and it may well be an area that's more likely to be prone to flooding of whatever kind. You're less likely to have insurance. So when that flooding comes and your property and your goods, your things you own are damaged, you'll have less ability to replace them. That effectively will reduce your asset base and make you poorer still. So that kind of spiral of inequality occurs here in the UK as well as when we look globally, and really dramatic data on the health impact of flooding on people in the UK, that in the 2007 floods, people in the lowest income groups were 8 times more likely to report mental health problems than people in the higher income groups. And in part that was because they were often out of their homes for very much longer because they didn't have the insurance cover to get their homes refurbished quickly and to get back up and running again. So we really do need to take these stark inequality issues into account. So as I've said, the Climate Change Act covers this, and we have this process that every 5 years the UK government has to present its climate change risk assessment, and it did that on Monday for the 5 years starting 2022. And next year it will present its national adaptation programme, which will say how it will address the risks facing the UK. And the climate change risk assessment is produced on the basis of advice from the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee, and then every 2 years we will look at the government's progress in delivering its national adaptation programme actions. So let me just say a few words about what our advice to the government was and what the government's latest climate change risk assessment says. So our advice and our evidence base that we published last year for the government said that the urgency of adaptation has increased since we last did this 5 years ago. So basically, the risks that we looked at had all got more severe. So the strong message was the adaptation action we've been taking has not been keeping up with the way that risk is increasing, and we really have to do more. As we gradually are accumulating more and more data to understand the benefits of taking adaptation action, we're finding that the cost benefits are very, very significant, that the ratios of the benefits to the costs are in some cases, for example, water efficiency measures, as high as 10 to 1 or even higher. But almost everything we've looked at, the benefits to cost ratio is above 1. So it is well worth investing in adaptation, but we're not yet doing enough of it. we highlighted to the government in our advice that we thought there were 8 key areas where they really needed to think urgently in the next couple of years about addressing these risks. And in part, this was because there are opportunities in legislation to do something about them. So, for example, the recently passed Environment Act covering many of the issues to do with nature, but also some of these because they're associated with achieving net zero. So things like the risks to natural carbon stores from climate hazards, the risks to crops and commercial trees from climate hazards. If we're going to deliver the nature-based solutions that we need for getting to net zero, for doing that netting off bit, then we have to make sure that peat continues to store carbon and doesn't release it to the atmosphere. We have to make sure that we understand which trees we can plant where, but also that they will have adequate water supply and be adequately, as far as we can, protected from pests and diseases and things. So these were issues that were critical in terms of current legislation, but also in terms of achieving net zero in the future. And I pointed out to you how much more dependent we will be on electricity by 2050. So one of these risks that we felt the government really needed to address in more detail now was the risks to people in the economy from climate-related failure of the power system. And indeed, we saw that last year when Storm Arwen was particularly severe and took out electricity for many people in Scotland and the north of England, some of whom were without electricity for periods of a week or more. Now, at the moment, electricity provides some 30% of our energy needs. When it provides 70% of our energy needs, really, when the electricity stops, life will kind of grind to a halt. There will be lots and lots, even more kind of knock-on consequences than there are today. So as we're building this electricity system for the future, we really have got to take this into account much, much more seriously than we have had to date. As we're building many new buildings, we need to be taking into account they're going to be standing in the future when we're seeing these much higher temperatures. So it's really crucial we take into account heat. It's really crucial that we start to think about risks to our supply chains. I think COVID has brought home to us the kind of challenge of supply chain risks, but climate change causes supply chain risks as well, particularly when areas overseas can no longer produce tea or coffee or other things that are critical to us. And one of the other pieces of advice we gave the government was to say, you really have to think about adaptation in all of the new policy that you're producing. And we did a quick survey of recent policies and said, well, which ones of them take into account adaptation and which ones of them don't? And actually the net zero strategy barely mentions adaptation at all, a real missed opportunity there. So it really needs to be central to all government policy making. So as I say, on Monday, the government provided its climate change risk assessment based on our advice. And I'm delighted to say it accepted all of the recommendations we had made and what's the scale of the challenge that was set out in our advice report on the climate change risk assessment. It recognises that we have to go much further and faster to prepare for the warming climate, and that we really have barely started this journey. So we've got to get moving on it. We were very pleased to see it recognises that we must mainstream adaptation in government policy. So that last slide I was showing you that shows how much important policy to do with climate has pretty much ignored adaptation recently. But it doesn't actually say what the government is going to do. For that, we have to wait for the new National Adaptation Programme in 2023. So lots of good intent, positive words, recognition that change needs to come, but we really do need to see that change urgently. And it's slightly frustrating that we're going to be waiting another year before we see significant developments. So I think my message on both mitigation and adaptation is that we've got to move from pledges and plans and good words to action. And let me just finish with a quote that I very much like from Greta Thunberg, which is that this needs cathedral thinking. We can build the foundations without knowing exactly how we're going to build the roof. And of course, we'd never have built Salisbury Cathedral, which is what this is a picture of, if they'd waited to work out what the roof was going to look like. It took another 200 years or so for them to build the spire. So the guys who started on this didn't ever find out what it was going to look like. But we don't have to have all the answers before we get on with making the changes, because we know enough of the right things to do that really we just need to get going. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much, Julia. To the audience, if you'd like to ask questions, please ask